30-day ceasefire. Maybe it's an important step toward diplomatically ending the war, or maybe it's an attempt to derail those efforts and to try and keep the war and U.S. support for it going.
And that's the interesting question, because ever since news dropped that Ukraine was open to a ceasefire with Russia, and by the way, it doesn't seem like Russia's responded, some people have suggested, well, this is actually a good step on the path toward peace and ending U.S. involvement. But I think it's interesting because a lot of people have made some good arguments about why it actually might be counterintuitive, why it might embroil the U.S. more in that conflict for a longer period than many anticipated, especially the ones that voted for Trump. So I want to hear Glenn's take on it. Let's watch and respond.
One of the reasons to be suspicious of this ceasefire that Ukraine has agreed to is that some of the worst people in Europe are also applauding it and are embracing the framework that Marco Rubio and Zelensky and others are pushing. Here, for example, is the unelected leader of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, who is one of the most fanatical militarists in the world right now. She's the one who's been demanding that Europe massively rearm, that the war in Ukraine continue, even if without the United States. And here's what she says, quote, "We welcome today's news from Jeddah on the U.S.-Ukraine talks, including the proposal for a ceasefire agreement and the resumption of U.S. intelligence sharing and security assistance. This is a positive development that can be a step toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine. The ball is now in Russia's court." I'm telling you, they all said that. It's clearly part of the script.
I love how Glenn laughed when he wrote that. That's so true. If you look at social media right now, all the talking heads in the corporate media, a lot of government officials, etc., are saying that same line. So it's kind of funny to see him smirk while he says it.
The EU is ready to play its full part together with its partners in the upcoming peace negotiations. Here's one of the people who might be one of the very few people even more extreme than Ursula von der Leyen. It's Kaja Kallas, the former prime minister of Estonia, who's now the foreign affairs minister of the EU. And she is openly talking about how we have to defeat Russia in order to then prove to China that we can also beat them in a war, and how if we are too scared to go to war with Russia, then the Chinese would see we're too scared to go to war with them as well. That's the kind of thing she's been saying, and here's what she said about this peace deal. Quote, "I welcome the U.S.-Ukraine talks in Jeddah, notably regarding a ceasefire and resumption of U.S. intelligence and security assistance to Ukraine, but also in humanitarian field. The ball, as always, is in Russia's court. The EU will do its full part to achieve a just and durable peace."
It's so ridiculous. The most ironic thing about the ball being in Russia's court is that this conflict could have ended so many times earlier. The ball was really in U.S. and NATO's court. NATO didn't have to expand all the way to the east beyond the bounds of where Gorbachev and James Baker and Bush agreed to at the end of the Cold War. This never had to happen, and it was just a series of miscalculations that culminated in the Maidan coup, where the U.S. helped overthrow the democratically elected Yanukovych. So saying that the ball's in Russia's court, as always, is pretty crazy. I mean, Russia was really pushed to the brink and beyond what they deemed as acceptable. That's not to justify the invasion whatsoever. It's just to say that this was provoked. And that's so thoroughly documented at this point, it's crazy.
Here's the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who has talked about wanting to send British troops to Ukraine, even as he acknowledges that he can't do so without U.S. support, says, quote, "I warmly welcome the agreement today in Jeddah and congratulate President Trump and President Zelensky for this remarkable breakthrough. This is an important moment for peace in Ukraine, and we now all need to redouble our efforts to get to a lasting and secure peace as soon as possible. As both American and Ukrainian delegations have said, the ball is now in Russia's court. Russia must now agree to a ceasefire and end to the fighting too. I will be convening leaders this Saturday to discuss next steps. We are ready to bring an end to this war in a just and permanent way that allows Ukraine to enjoy its freedom." Now, the issue is that Russia is fighting this war for reasons that it perceives as important. And the idea that they're just going to agree to an end to the war without securing the objectives that they have fought for 3 years to achieve seems very unlikely, even as a temporary ceasefire. But this is obviously something that these Europeans see and other supporters of the war in Ukraine see as an attempt to make Trump believe that the problem is not Ukraine, but instead is Russia. Here's what Trump said when asked about this in the White House. I just want to, before I show this, just talk about, independent of my criticism of the Trump administration or the praise I have for the Trump administration, both of which I've expressed, it is really remarkable. I don't think I can think of a president in my lifetime for whom this has been true, how constant and available Trump is to questions from the media. He's essentially every day explaining what his government is doing, what his objectives are, what his thinking is.
Just like in the previous administration when the deep state was Biden was always available to take such questions as well.
The contrast with Joe Biden, who could barely put together a sentence, is obvious, but even prior presidents didn't constantly have the media in the Oval Office where they were just available for questions seemingly on a daily basis about every issue that the media wants to talk about. But that is what Trump has been doing. Here is what Trump had to say on this ceasefire deal.
You said earlier that it was now up to Russia in terms of the ceasefire.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can do in terms of pressuring Russia or in terms of sanctions? Or what can you do?
We can, but I hope it's not going to be necessary. Sure, we can pressure. We can do that with Russia. Remember this, Russia took Georgia from Bush, right? They took Crimea from a man named Obama, Barack Hussein Obama, right? They tried to take the whole thing from Biden. They're going for the whole ball of wax. Who was the only one that never took anything from Trump?
They actually took about $300 million worth of U.S. aid from Trump when he was trying to avoid impeachment, and they still impeached him anyways, by the way, and he still boasts about giving them the javelin, so they at least took that from him. But the point still stands, I suppose, in some context.
Now, it's a little hard to understand what he's saying there, but he, again, is definitely of the view that pressuring Russia might be necessary, but he obviously has positive feelings towards Putin, believes Putin respects him. And so I'm not necessarily sounding pressing the panic button on this in the sense that, oh, this is really a ploy to get Trump back on Zelensky's side. I do think that's what a lot of people are hoping will happen, which is why these EU leaders are saying what they're saying. But I also believe that Trump is sufficiently determined to get this deal done. And I don't necessarily think he's just going to overnight start viewing Putin as the problem and saying, oh, we have to get behind Zelensky and get behind the war effort.
Yeah, let's go back to the Trump that said, you don't have the cards. You're gambling with millions of lives. You're gambling with World War III. That's the Trump we need back.
But it is something to look out for. Now, there are a couple of people, of course, who are angry about this ceasefire, who think that even just the ceasefire itself is already too much of a concession to Russia. One of them is CNN's favorite foreign affairs analyst, John Bolton, who a lot of liberals have come to love as well because of his criticism of Donald Trump. Here he is on the CBC. When asked about his view of the ceasefire, here's what he had to say.
So now, for more on all of this, we've reached John Bolton. He's a former U.S. National Security Advisor and a former U.S. Ambassador to the UN. Welcome. Thank you for making time for us.
Glad to be with you.
Now, neither President Zelensky nor President Trump will attend the talks between the Ukrainian and U.S. delegations that are scheduled for tomorrow. So will peace be attainable if one side has to make all the concessions here?
Well, I think the best that could come out of these meetings in Saudi Arabia is to try and get U.S.-Ukrainian relations back on track. I expect that this minerals deal will be signed. I don't think that will have much impact on anything, frankly, but it's important to Trump, and he can declare victory, and that might pacify him for a while. But I think the real question is not specifically what this meeting will accomplish, but how Ukraine and the rest of NATO will deal with Trump's essentially 180-degree reversal of position, basically to be supporting Moscow, which has dismayed many people in the United States, as it has throughout the alliance.
And then here is the Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, who, as we've shown you before, not only was part of the effort in 2014 with Victoria Nuland and John McCain, the National Endowment for Democracy and U.S. aid, to go to Ukraine and encourage the anti-government protesters who eventually forcibly removed the democratically elected president, but he boasted about the fact that the United States played a critical role in getting in driving out the elected leader of Ukraine. Here is what he had to say. He's still a very vocal and vehement supporter, like almost all Democrats are, of U.S. support for the war in Ukraine. He said this, quote, "Let's be clear what happened. Trump cut off arms and intelligence sharing, putting Ukraine on the brink of defeat in order to get Zelensky to support a Russia-designed, quote, ceasefire that essentially hands Russia huge amounts of Ukrainian territory with no Russian concessions."
It's so crazy for him to call it a Russian-designed ceasefire, because Russia hasn't even responded as to whether they want this. In fact, a lot of people don't think they want this. Lavrov, their foreign minister, has said, why would we agree to this in hypothetical situations before? So this is just freaking crazy.
Now, none of that makes sense. There has been no ceasefire. The Russians haven't agreed to one. The idea that this is what they wanted seems preposterous, but there's obviously going to be an attempt, if Trump ends up facilitating a end to the war and a peace deal in Ukraine, as he campaigned on doing, and the American people ratified that in an election. If that ends up happening, I'm telling you now what's going to be the narrative, which is that even though it's the case that there's no chance that the Ukrainians could win this war, certainly not as NATO defined victory, or even from any kind of perspective, the Russians are going to continue to occupy more of their country if the war goes on. More Ukrainians are going to be killed. More of the country is going to be destroyed. Even though that's the case, if Trump ends up succeeding in facilitating a peace deal in Ukraine, the narrative is going to be that Trump essentially parachuted in, prevented the Ukrainians from winning, and handed Russia everything that it wanted, and that Russia won the war not because it was winning anyway and would have won inevitably, which is true, but only because Trump, being enamored of Putin or being a Russian agent or a traitor or whatever, ended up giving everything to the Russians. I think the good thing about Trump is he no longer cares about those kinds of claims.
Yeah, Russiagate does not have the same hold that it had, a few years ago. That's for sure.
He seems genuinely committed to me to trying to end the war. I think he is less naive and less easily manipulated now than he was in his first term, but there are still a lot of smart people in the Trump administration around Donald Trump whom Trump trusts, who I do not think share Trump's view of foreign policy in general or the war in Ukraine in particular.
Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz.
And there still are doubts, in my mind at least, about whether they will again succeed in sabotaging Trump's objectives, even though their oath and their duty is supposed to be to carry out the policy of the elected president. And I think that's the real interesting aspect of what is going on with this 30-day ceasefire. Maybe it's an important step toward diplomatically ending the war, or maybe it's an attempt to derail those efforts and to try and keep the war and U.S. support for it going.
And that's the interesting question. I've heard both sides of this argument. I think I come down on the side of that the ceasefire is a bad thing. This is liked by too many detestable people. And I know we have the John Boltons of the world that, that have a different view, but it just seems like it's counterintuitive for this ceasefire to go on when really it's proven that what gets Zelensky in panic mode is to withdraw U.S. support. And I'm with Douglas McGregor, who was on Tucker's show, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, where he said, just withdraw all the aid from Ukraine, all the men and all the intelligence, and the rest will follow. Jeffrey Sachs has said something similar to that today, I believe, on Andrew Napolitano's show. So I'm for just withdrawing aid. That's going to force the hand of Zelensky to make peace with Russia. This ceasefire, it just seems like a way that Trump can justify trying to hammer out a deal that may never come with Russia. And in the meantime, you know, we just continue to bleed treasury into the Ukrainian war project. So what do you think? Let me know in a comment below. Do you think that the ceasefire is a good thing when it comes to the potential for peace in Ukraine? Or do you think it's a bad thing? I want to hear from you. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire. Peace out.